Welcome to this journey into the shadows of American history, where the line between folklore and reality becomes dangerously thin. I'm your guide through the forgotten corridors of the past, and tonight we descend into one of the most disturbing cases ever documented in the rural South. Before we begin, I invite you to become part of our haunted community. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you alone in the dark, or do you have company? Your presence here connects us across time and distance, just as the story we're about to uncover connects the living with something far more sinister. This is the account of Alice Jones, the vampire bride of Redridge County, Arkansas. A case that defies rational explanation, a mystery that to this day remains unsolved. October 1887. The American South was still recovering from the wounds of the Civil War, a conflict that had ended 22 years prior, but whose scars remained deeply etched into the landscape and the people. Redridge County, nestled in the remote reaches of the Arkansas wilderness, near the Ozark mountain foothills, was a place where time seemed to move differently, a community of farmers, loggers, and God-fearing families who relied on the land and each other for survival. The nearest railway station was 40 miles away, the nearest telegraph office even farther. When something happened in Redridge County, the outside world rarely heard about it. And something did happen. On October 12, 1887, 19-year-old Alice Jones vanished without a trace. 3 days before her wedding to Eliott Bailey, a respected local farmer and son of one of the county's founding families, Alice disappeared from her family's homestead. The circumstances were peculiar from the start. Her bedroom window was found open, the curtains billowing in the cold autumn wind. Her nightgown lay on the floor, discarded. But there were no signs of struggle, no footprints in the soft earth below the window, no screams heard in the night. Alice was gone. For 7 days, the men of Redridge County searched. They combed through the dense pine forests, dragged the creeks, checked every abandoned cabin and hunting shelter within a 20-mile radius. Eliott Bailey rode day and night, calling her name until his voice was raw. The Jones family, prominent members of the local Methodist congregation, organized prayer vigils. Sheriff James Cordell, a veteran of the Confederate Army, who had seen his share of horror during the war, coordinated the search with military precision. Nothing. Then, on the evening of October 19th, Alice Jones walked out of the forest. She was found by a farmer named Dutch Henderson, who was checking his traps near Miller's Creek, about 8 miles from the Jones property. Dutch later testified that he nearly shot her, thinking she was an apparition. She wore no shoes. Her feet were cut and bleeding, but she didn't seem to notice. Her dress, the one she had been wearing the night she vanished, was torn and stained with something dark. Mud, Dutch assumed, or perhaps blood. But it was Alice's appearance that truly disturbed him. Her skin, once healthy and sun-touched from working in her family's garden, was now pale as milk, almost translucent. Her eyes, which Dutch remembered as warm brown, now seemed darker, deeper, as if something behind them had changed fundamentally. She stared at him without recognition, without fear, without any emotion at all. "Miss Alice," Dutch had whispered, lowering his rifle, "is that you?" She didn't answer. She simply stood there, swaying slightly, as if listening to music only she could hear. Dutch brought her home. The Jones family wept with relief. Eliott Bailey held her in his arms and thanked God for her return. The wedding was postponed, naturally, to give Alice time to recover from her ordeal. The local doctor, Benjamin Thorne, examined her and found her physically unharmed, aside from the cuts on her feet and signs of exposure. When asked where she had been, what had happened to her, Alice provided no answers. She claimed to remember nothing, not her disappearance, not the 7 days in the wilderness, not how she had survived. But Redridge County would soon learn that Alice Jones had not returned alone. Something had followed her back. Something that would turn a small community's joy into unspeakable horror, and transform a young bride into the most feared figure in Arkansas folklore. The nightmare was only beginning. To understand what happened in Redridge County, we must first understand the place itself and the people who called it home. Redridge County was established in 1839, carved out of the wilderness by settlers moving west in search of fertile land and new opportunities. By 1887, it remained largely unchanged from its founding days. The county seat, a small town called Blackwater, consisted of a courthouse, a general store, 2 churches, a schoolhouse, and perhaps 30 homes scattered along a single dirt road. The population of the entire county barely exceeded 800 souls. The land was unforgiving. Dense forests of pine and oak covered the hillsides. Limestone caves riddled the earth, some extending for miles underground, unmapped and unexplored. Winter came early and stayed late. Summers were oppressively humid, breeding mosquitoes and disease. The people who survived here were tough, self-reliant, and deeply religious. They had to be. The Civil War had devastated the region. Arkansas, a Confederate state, had seen some of the war's bloodiest guerrilla fighting. Brother turned against brother, neighbor against neighbor. By the time the war ended in 1865, Redridge County had lost nearly a third of its male population. The survivors returned home to find their farms in ruins, their livestock stolen or slaughtered, their way of life shattered. In the years that followed, the community rebuilt slowly. They relied on each other, on family bonds that stretched back generations, and on their faith. The Methodist and Baptist churches became the centers of social life. Sunday services were not merely religious obligations, but opportunities for isolated families to gather, to share news, to maintain the fragile bonds that held the community together. Among the prominent families were the Baileys, the Jones, the Cordells, and the Whitmores. These families owned the largest farms, held positions of authority, and intermarried to strengthen their connections. The Bailey family had settled in Redridge County in 1841, and by 1887 they owned over 300 acres of prime farmland along the Red River tributary. Eliott Bailey, 26 years old in the autumn of 1887, was the eldest son and heir to the Bailey fortune, such as it was in that impoverished region. The Jones family had arrived later, in 1855, but had quickly established themselves through hard work and shrewd land purchases. Alice's father, Martin Jones, was a deacon at the Blackwater Methodist Church. Her mother, Clara Jones, was known throughout the county for her herbal remedies and midwifery skills. Alice was their only surviving child. 3 siblings had died in infancy, a common tragedy in that era. The engagement between Alice Jones and Eliott Bailey had been announced in July 1887, and the entire community had celebrated. It was more than a marriage. It was the union of 2 of Redridge County's founding families, a symbol of hope and continuity in a place that had seen too much death. Contemporary accounts paint Alice as a quiet, devout young woman. The Blackwater Parish record from August 1887 notes her participation in the church's charitable work, delivering food to elderly shut-ins and teaching Sunday school to the younger children. A letter written by her childhood friend, Mary Catherine Simmons, and preserved in the Arkansas Historical Society archives, describes Alice as gentle of spirit, with a voice like a mourning dove and hands that could coax life from the most stubborn garden soil. Eliott Bailey, by contrast, was known for his intensity. Sheriff Cordell's private journal, discovered in 1952 during the renovation of the old county courthouse, contains several references to Eliott. Cordell describes him as a man of strong passions and stronger convictions, devoted to his land and his God in equal measure, perhaps the finest horseman in the county, but possessed of a temper when provoked. It's important to note that in 1887, Redridge County existed in a peculiar intersection of modernity and superstition. While cities like Little Rock were beginning to see the influence of industrialization, electricity, and scientific thought, rural communities like Redridge remained firmly rooted in older traditions. Belief in the supernatural was not merely accepted, but expected. Stories of haunts, of spirits that walked the earth, of curses and omens were part of the fabric of daily life. The Ozark Mountains, looming to the north of Redridge County, carried their own dark reputation. The Cherokee people, who had been forcibly removed from the region decades earlier during the Trail of Tears, had left behind stories that the white settlers adopted and adapted. Tales of skinwalkers, of creatures that wore human faces but harbored inhuman appetites, of places in the deep woods where the veil between worlds grew thin. There were older stories too, whispers of European settlers who had brought their own superstitions across the Atlantic. German immigrants in nearby counties spoke of Naxera, revenants that consumed their own burial shrouds and then emerged to feed on the living. Irish and Scottish families passed down legends of the Baoban Sith, beautiful women who danced men to death and drank their blood. In the decade preceding Alice Jones's disappearance, several incidents had unsettled Redridge County. In 1878, a cattle mutilation event left 12 head of livestock dead and drained of blood on the Whitmore property. No rational explanation was ever found. In 1882, a traveling preacher named Josiah Black had arrived in Blackwater, preaching a strange gospel that mixed Christian scripture with occult symbolism. He was run out of town after 3 weeks, but not before holding secret meetings in the woods that some residents attended. The names of those attendees were never publicly revealed, but rumors persisted. And then there were the caves, limestone caverns that extended beneath much of the county, some of which had never been fully explored. Local children were strictly forbidden from entering them. The adults spoke of people who had gone into those caves and never returned, or worse, who had returned changed, speaking in tongues, their minds broken by what they had witnessed in the darkness beneath the earth. This was the world Alice Jones inhabited. A world where faith and fear walked hand in hand, where the line between the natural and supernatural was never quite clear, where the old ways persisted beneath a veneer of Christian respectability. On October 12, 1887, that veneer cracked, and through that crack something ancient and hungry emerged. Alice Jones returned to her family's home on the evening of October 19, 1887. For the first 3 days, the community celebrated her safe return as a miracle. Prayer services were held at the Blackwater Methodist Church, thanking God for delivering one of their own from the wilderness. Neighbors brought food, flowers, and gifts. Eliott Bailey barely left her side, holding her hand, speaking softly to her, trying to coax from her some memory of where she had been. But Alice remained silent on the matter, and she had changed. Mary Catherine Simmons, Alice's closest friend, visited on October 21st. In a letter dated November 3, 1887, written to her sister in Memphis, and now archived at the University of Arkansas Special Collections, Mary Catherine described the visit in disturbing detail. I hardly recognized her, though we had been as close as sisters since childhood. Alice sat in a chair by the window, staring out at nothing. Her skin had gone so pale I could see the blue veins beneath, like a spider's web beneath ice. When I spoke to her, she turned to look at me, but her eyes seemed to look through me, as if I were made of glass. I asked how she was feeling. She smiled, but it was not Alice's smile. It was the smile of something wearing Alice's face. Dr. Benjamin Thorne, the county's only physician, examined Alice multiple times during those first days. His medical notes, preserved in the Redridge County archives, make for unsettling reading. On October 20th, he recorded, "Patient presents with severe pallor, possibly anemic, pulse weak and irregular, approximately 45 beats per minute, temperature subnormal at 96.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Patient complains of sensitivity to sunlight and reports persistent thirst, though refuses most food and drink. Pupils dilated and unresponsive to light stimulus. Diagnosis uncertain. Have recommended iron tonic and bed rest." By October 22nd, Dr. Thorne's notes had taken on a more disturbed tone. Patient's condition defies medical explanation. Weight loss of approximately 12 pounds in 3 days, despite family's insistence that she has been eating. Examination of the oral cavity reveals unusual dental development. Canine teeth appear elongated and sharpened, though this may be observer error or result of malnutrition. Patient becomes agitated when mirrors are brought near. Family reports she will not enter the chapel room where the family Bible is kept. Have consulted medical texts but find no comparable case study. The Jones family tried to keep these details private, but in a community as small and interconnected as Redridge County, secrets were impossible to maintain. Whispers began to circulate. Something was wrong with Alice Jones, something unnatural. The wedding was indefinitely postponed. Eliott Bailey, torn between love and growing unease, continued his visits, but neighbors noted that he left the Jones property each evening looking increasingly troubled. Sheriff Cordell, whose duties included welfare checks on the community's residents, stopped by the Jones homestead on October 24th. His journal entry from that date reads, "Visited the Jones family today. Alice appears gravely ill, though Doc Thorne can't determine the cause. Martin and Clara are beside themselves with worry. The girl barely speaks, barely moves. When I asked her directly about her disappearance, she looked at me with eyes that made my blood run cold. I have seen men die on the battlefield. I have looked into the eyes of the dying. This was different. Alice Jones's eyes held something I cannot name and do not wish to name." Then, on the night of October 25th, 1887, the first death occurred. Samuel Tucker, a 43-year-old farmer who lived approximately 2 miles from the Jones property, was found dead in his barn by his wife Esther on the morning of October 26th. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. The official death certificate, signed by Dr. Thorne and filed with the county clerk, lists the cause of death as heart failure. But Dr. Thorne's private notes tell a different story. In an entry marked "Confidential," he wrote, "Samuel Tucker's body presents with complete exsanguination. No visible wounds save 2 small puncture marks on the left side of the neck, approximately 1 inch apart. The body is drained of blood. I have never seen anything like it in 30 years of medical practice. Rigor mortis delayed. Eyes open and fixed in an expression of terror. Dare not record true findings on official documents for fear of causing panic." Esther Tucker, in her statement to Sheriff Cordell, reported that her husband had gone to the barn around midnight to check on a horse that had been acting nervous. She heard no sounds of struggle, no cries for help. When he didn't return after an hour, she went to investigate and found him collapsed in the straw, his skin white as parchment, his body cold. The community was shaken. Samuel Tucker had been a well-liked man, a deacon at the Baptist church, a father of 4. His funeral was held on October 28th, and nearly the entire county attended. But even as they mourned, a horrible rumor began to spread. On the night Samuel Tucker died, Alice Jones had been seen walking near his property. 3 witnesses came forward, though 2 later recanted their statements under pressure from their families and the church. The one who maintained his testimony was a young man named Jacob Mills, who had been hunting possums near Tucker's farm on the night in question. In his sworn statement to Sheriff Cordell, dated October 30th, Jacob described seeing a figure in white moving through the trees like smoke, heading in the direction of Tucker's barn around 11:30 at night. When pressed, Jacob admitted he couldn't say for certain it was Alice Jones. It was dark, and he had been some distance away, but the figure moved like her, he insisted, and he had felt, even from that distance, that he was in the presence of something wrong, something evil. Martin and Clara Jones vehemently denied that Alice had left the house that night. They insisted she had been in her bedroom, under their watch, the entire evening. But their protests rang hollow. The layout of the Jones house was well known. Alice's bedroom was on the ground floor, with direct access to the outside through a window. Sheriff Cordell found himself in an impossible position. He had no evidence, no proof of any wrongdoing. Even Dr. Thorne's private suspicions were not enough to build a case on. What was he supposed to do? Arrest Alice Jones on suspicion of being a vampire? The very idea was absurd, the stuff of European folk tales and pennied dreadful novels, not modern American justice. But then, on the night of November 2nd, the second death occurred. This time, the victim was closer to home. 16-year-old Sarah Brennan, a distant cousin of Eliott Bailey, was found dead in her family's root cellar. The circumstances were identical to Samuel Tucker's death: complete exsanguination, 2 puncture wounds on the neck, no sign of struggle. And Sarah had last been seen alive speaking with Alice Jones at the Blackwater General Store earlier that day. The community's fear turned to panic. 2 deaths in 8 days, both victims drained of blood, both connected, however tenuously, to Alice Jones. The churches held emergency prayer meetings. Families began locking their doors and windows at night, something that had never been necessary in Redridge County's peaceful history. Children were forbidden from going outside after dark. And Alice? Alice Jones remained in her family's home, growing paler, growing stranger, speaking less and less, until she communicated only in whispers and long hollow stares. Eliott Bailey, the man who had loved her, who had searched for her day and night when she vanished, now faced an impossible choice. His family demanded he break the engagement. The community whispered that Alice was cursed, possessed, or worse, but Eliott's heart could not accept what his mind was beginning to understand. On November 4th, 1887, a town meeting was held at the courthouse in Blackwater. Nearly 200 residents attended, more than had ever gathered for any civic event. The subject of discussion was never officially recorded in the meeting minutes, but personal letters and diary entries from attendees make it clear they were deciding what to do about Alice Jones. Some called for her arrest. Others demanded she be committed to the state asylum in Little Rock. A few voices, quieter but more disturbing, suggested older remedies. Methods that had been used in Europe for centuries when communities faced the threat of the undead. Sheriff Cordell tried to maintain order, to appeal to reason and law, but reason was losing its grip on Redridge County. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Is this a case of genuine supernatural evil, or is there a rational explanation hiding in the shadows of 1887? Your theories matter, because the truth, if there even is a truth, is stranger than anything the residents of Redridge County could have imagined. The horror was only deepening. The town meeting of November 4th ended without resolution, but it had planted a seed of action in Sheriff James Cordell's mind. Despite his skepticism, despite his commitment to law and order, he could no longer ignore what was happening in Redridge County. 2 people were dead under inexplicable circumstances. A third death would shatter the community entirely. On the morning of November 5th, Sheriff Cordell made a decision that would change everything. He would conduct a thorough investigation of the Jones property with or without the family's cooperation. He arrived at the Jones homestead with his deputy, William Chase, and Dr. Benjamin Thorne. Martin Jones met them at the door, his face haggard from sleepless nights. Clara Jones stood behind him, her eyes red from weeping. They protested initially, but Cordell was firm. This was no longer a private family matter. This was a criminal investigation. Alice was in her room, the curtains drawn against the late morning sun. Cordell noticed immediately that the room was unnaturally cold, despite the fire burning in the main house. Alice sat in the corner, wrapped in blankets, her face turned away from them. When Cordell spoke her name, she did not respond. But it was not Alice's room that yielded the first major discovery. It was the family Bible. Clara Jones kept the Bible in a wooden chest in the parlor, along with other family documents and heirlooms. As Cordell and Dr. Thorne examined the room, looking for anything unusual, Deputy Chase opened the chest. Inside, beneath letters and photographs, he found something that made his blood run cold. A journal, leather-bound, water-stained, and very old. The handwriting inside was faded but legible. The journal belonged to Margaret Jones, Alice's paternal grandmother, who had died in 1871. Dr. Thorne began reading aloud. The entries started innocently enough, daily observations, recipes, prayers. But as he turned the pages, the content changed. Margaret Jones had documented something in the years before her death, something she claimed to have inherited from her own mother, passed down through generations of Jones women. An entry from March 1869 read, "The old covenant remains, as it has always remained. We who carry the bloodline carry also the burden. Mother told me, as her mother told her, stretching back to the crossing of the ocean. There are things that sleep in the earth, waiting, things that must be appeased. The men do not know. They cannot know. This is women's work, women's sacrifice." Cordell felt a chill despite the warmth of the parlor. He ordered Deputy Chase to search the property more thoroughly, particularly the family's private burial plot behind the house. The Jones family plot contained 7 marked graves, grandparents, deceased siblings, an uncle who died in the war. But as Deputy Chase and a group of hastily recruited townsmen began surveying the area, they noticed something disturbing. The ground in the far corner of the plot, beyond the marked graves, showed signs of disturbance, old disturbance long since overgrown, but visible to trained eyes. They began to dig. 3 feet down, they found the first skeleton, an adult female, based on the bone structure. No coffin, no marker, simply bones wrapped in decaying cloth. Dr. Thorne estimated the remains were at least 40 years old, possibly older. They kept digging. By sunset on November 5th, they had uncovered 6 unmarked graves. 6 bodies, all female, all buried in secret behind the Jones family plot. The discovery sent shockwaves through those present. Who were these women? Why were they buried here, unmarked and unmourned? Martin Jones, confronted with the evidence, claimed to know nothing about the graves. His father had never mentioned them. But Clara Jones's reaction was different. She collapsed, weeping, and through her tears she whispered a confession that would crack open the true horror of what was happening in Redridge County. "They were the brides," Clara said, her voice breaking. "All of them were brides. It's always the brides." Sheriff Cordell demanded an explanation, but Clara had fallen into hysterics. Dr. Thorne administered laudanum to calm her, and they carried her inside. As night fell over the Jones property, Cordell stood among the unmarked graves and felt the weight of something ancient and evil pressing down on him. The investigation was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. Because that night, as Cordell and his men maintained watch, over the Jones house, Alice disappeared again. Her bedroom window was found open, the curtains moving in the cold November wind. Her nightgown lay discarded on the floor. And when they searched the property, they found footprints in the frost leading away from the house, heading north into the forest, toward the caves. The search for Alice Jones resumed at first light on November 6th, but this time Sheriff Cordell had a destination in mind. The limestone caves that riddled the hills north of the Jones property had always been considered dangerous, off-limits, the domain of wild animals and darker things. Now, following Alice's footprints in the early morning frost, Cordell understood that the caves held answers. While Deputy Chase organized the search party, Cordell returned to Margaret Jones's journal. He spent the pre-dawn hours reading by lamplight, and what he discovered made him question everything he thought he knew about Redridge County's founding families. Margaret Jones had written extensively about what she called the Covenant. According to her entries, the Jones family lineage traced back to a small village in Germany called Schattendorf, Shadow Village. In the 1790s, a plague had ravaged the village. The dead were buried hastily, improperly, and according to local belief, some of them returned, not as ghosts, but as physical beings. Nachtseher, the devourers. The village priest, desperate to save his flock, had performed a ritual of binding. He had made a covenant with the entity that led the Nachtseher, a being Margaret referred to only as der Blutbräutigam, the blood bridegroom. The covenant was simple and terrible. Every third generation, on the eve of a wedding, a bride would be offered. She would be taken, transformed, and bound to the blood bridegroom. In exchange, the families who made this covenant would prosper. Their crops would flourish. Their livestock would thrive. They would be protected from disease and disaster. But the price was absolute. The bride would be lost, consumed by darkness, and she would hunger. Margaret Jones had written, "Mother explained it to me on my wedding day. I was not chosen. I was second born, and the covenant takes only the first daughter of the third generation. My sister Anna was chosen. I watched her change after she returned from the forest. I watched her feed, and then I watched the men of the village drive a stake through her heart and burn her body. The covenant was broken in the old and country, but the blood remains. The blood remembers." The Jones family had immigrated to America in 1822, believing they had escaped the curse. But curses, Margaret wrote, do not respect oceans. They travel in the blood. The unmarked graves behind the Jones house were not random victims. They were Jones women, stretching back generations. First daughters who had shown signs of the transformation. Women who had been killed by their own families to prevent them from becoming monsters. But killing them didn't break the covenant. It only delayed it. Alice Jones was a first daughter, third generation from her grandmother's line, and in October 1887, on the eve of her wedding, the covenant had come due. Margaret's final entry, dated October 1871, just weeks before her death, read, "I have tried to spare Clara the knowledge. I have tried to protect Alice, though she is only a child now. But I know the truth. The blood bridegroom is patient. He waits in the darkness beneath the earth. And when the time comes, he will claim what was promised to him 200 years ago. God forgive us all." Sheriff Cordell closed the journal with trembling hands. This was madness, supernatural nonsense from the superstitious old world. And yet the evidence surrounded him. The unmarked graves, the deaths, Alice's transformation. He had to know the truth. He had to find Alice. The search party assembled at dawn, 20 men armed with rifles, torches, and a grim determination. Eliott Bailey was among them, despite Cordell's protests. The young man's face was set like stone. He carried a shotgun and a leather satchel that clinked with the sound of metal stakes. "I won't let her suffer," Eliott said quietly. "If she's become what they say, I'll end it, quickly, mercifully, because I loved her." They followed the footprints into the forest, through the dense undergrowth, as the November sun struggled to penetrate the canopy above. The footprints led them to an outcropping of limestone where a cave mouth yawned like a wound in the earth. The entrance was marked with symbols, carved into the rock, weathered by decades of exposure but still visible, Germanic runes, protective wards, and beneath them, painted in what looked like dried blood, a single word in archaic German, Brautkammer, the bridal chamber. Sheriff Cordell lit his torch and stepped into the darkness. Behind him, the search party followed, descending into the earth where something old and hungry had been waiting for. Generations. The cave system was vast, far larger than anyone had suspected. Tunnels branched off in multiple directions, some barely wide enough to crawl through, others opening into cathedral-sized chambers where stalactites hung like teeth. The air was cold and damp, carrying a smell that made several men gag, decay, mixed with something sweeter, more cloying, like flowers left too long in a closed room. Sheriff Cordell led the party deeper, following scratches on the cave walls that seemed to mark a path. After what felt like hours, but was likely only 30 minutes, they emerged into a large chamber. And there, they found the bridal chamber. It was a natural cathedral of stone, approximately 40 feet across, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadow. But what made the men recoil in horror was what the chamber contained. Against the far wall stood an altar of sorts, carved from the living rock. On it lay the skeletal remains of a woman, still wearing the tattered remnants of a wedding dress from a bygone era. Candles, long since burned to nothing, surrounded the altar, and carved into every surface of the chamber walls were symbols, the same Germanic runes from the entrance, repeated thousands of times, covering every available inch of stone. But it was what lay before the altar that stopped Cordell's breath. 7 bodies, recent bodies, arranged in a circle, their throats torn open, their blood drained into a channel carved in the stone floor that led directly to the altar. Cordell recognized 3 of them, Samuel Tucker, Sarah Brennan, and 5 others from neighboring communities, people who had been reported missing over the past 2 weeks, but whose disappearances hadn't been connected until now. "Dear God," Dr. Thorne whispered. "What is this place?" A voice answered from the shadows. A woman's voice, but changed, hollow, echoing as if coming from a great distance. "This is where the covenant is fulfilled, where the brides come home." Alice Jones stepped into the torchlight. She was barely recognizable. Her skin was corpse pale, her eyes completely black, reflecting no light. Her teeth, when she smiled, were needle-sharp. The transformation was complete. She was no longer human, not entirely. She was something in between, something that existed in the space where life and death meet and merge. "Alice!" Eliott Bailey said, his voice breaking. He stepped forward, lowering his shotgun. "Alice, please, come back to us. Fight it!" Alice tilted her head, studying him with those terrible black eyes. "I am Alice, and I am so much more. I remember now. I remember all of them. Margaret, Anna, Catherine, Elise, all the brides who came before me. We are together now. We are one." She gestured to the skeleton on the altar. "The first bride, the one who made the covenant. She waits here, and we feed her with blood so that the bargain continues. Prosperity for the family, protection from harm. All it costs is a single bride every 3 generations. All it costs is me." "This is insanity," Sheriff Cordell said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Alice, you're sick. You need help. Come with us." Alice laughed, and the sound echoed through the chamber like breaking glass. "Help? You cannot help me, Sheriff. The transformation is complete. I have drunk from the blood bridegroom's cup. I have been remade, and I hunger, constantly, eternally. I will hunger until the covenant is broken or until I am destroyed." Eliott raised his shotgun, tears streaming down his face. "Then I'll destroy you. I'll end your suffering." "You cannot," Alice said softly, "because you love me, and love makes you weak." She moved faster than any human could move, crossing the distance between them in a heartbeat. Her hand closed around Eliott's throat, lifting him off the ground. The shotgun clattered to the cave floor. The other men opened fire. Bullets struck Alice's body, tore through her flesh. But she didn't fall. She didn't even flinch. She held Eliott, aloft, her mouth opening impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "Join me," she whispered. "Join me in the darkness, my love." It was Dr. Thorne who acted. The elderly physician grabbed one of the metal stakes from Eliott's fallen satchel and drove it through Alice's back with all his strength, piercing her heart. Alice screamed. It was a sound no human throat could produce, part shriek, part roar, part sob of infinite sorrow. She dropped Eliott and stumbled backward, clawing at the stake, protruding from her chest. "Run!" Cordell shouted. "Everyone out, now!" The men fled, half-dragging Eliott, who was sobbing hysterically. Behind them, Alice's screams grew louder, more anguished, as the cave itself seemed to respond to her agony. Rocks fell from the ceiling. Cracks appeared in the walls. They burst out of the cave entrance just as a massive section of the tunnel collapsed behind them, sealing the bridal chamber and Alice Jones inside. The men stood in the cold November morning, covered in dust and blood, traumatized by what they had witnessed. Eliott Bailey knelt on the ground, his face buried in his hands, his body racked with sobs. Sheriff Cordell looked back at the sealed cave entrance and knew with absolute certainty that this was not over. The covenant might be broken, but the horror would endure. Alice Jones, the vampire bride of Redridge County, was trapped but not destroyed. And in the darkness beneath the earth, she would wait. The official record of what happened in Redridge County in November 1887 is sparse, sanitized, deliberately incomplete. The county death certificates for Samuel Tucker and Sarah Brennan list natural causes. The disappearance of 5 others from neighboring communities was attributed to migration or unknown circumstances. The collapse of the cave north of the Jones property was recorded as a geological incident. Alice Jones's death certificate, filed on November 15, 1887, states that she died of consumption and was buried in the family plot. But there is no record of a body being recovered. No funeral was held. The entry exists solely to close the case, to allow the community to move forward and forget. And for decades, that's exactly what happened. Redridge County buried its horror and tried to heal, but the past, like Alice Jones herself, does not stay buried. In the summer of 1952, a history teacher named Robert Blackwell came to Redridge County to research his doctoral dissertation on post-Civil War settlement patterns in Arkansas. Blackwell was staying with a local family when he heard whispers about the vampire bride, stories the older residents would tell in hushed voices but refused to discuss in detail. Intrigued, Blackwell requested access to the county archives. What he found shocked him. The official records told one story, but tucked between pages of ledgers and property deeds, he discovered Sheriff James Cordell's private journal. The one Cordell had kept separate from official documentation. In his published dissertation, Shadows of the Ozarks, Folklore and Reality in 19th Century Arkansas, University of Chicago Press, 1955, Blackwell dedicated an entire chapter to the Alice Jones case. He was careful to present it as a cautionary tale about mass hysteria and scapegoating, but his private notes, now housed at the Arkansas Historical Society, reveal his true thoughts. "I do not believe in vampires. I am a man of science, of rational thought. But I have read, Cordell's journal in its entirety, and I cannot explain what happened in November 1887. The level of detail, the consistency of witness accounts, the physical evidence documented. This was not mass delusion. Something happened in Redridge County, something that defies conventional explanation. Blackwell interviewed 3 survivors from 1887 who were still alive in 1952. Mary Catherine Simmons, then 84 years old, Deputy William Chase, 91, and Dutch Henderson, 88. All 3 corroborated the essential facts of Cordell's journal, though each was reluctant to discuss the supernatural elements. Mary Catherine's testimony was particularly disturbing. She told Blackwell, "Alice came to me in my dreams for years after that November. She would stand at the foot of my bed, pale as moonlight, and whisper that she was still waiting, still hungry. I moved away from Redridge County in 1890 and never returned until now. But I can still hear her voice sometimes, when the night is very dark and very quiet." Blackwell's research brought renewed attention to the case, but the community of Redridge County, by then modernized with electricity and paved roads, dismissed the stories as folklore. The cave where Alice had been sealed remained undisturbed, marked only by a weathered sign warning of dangerous conditions. In October 1964, exactly 77 years after Alice's disappearance, a photographer named Ellen Graves traveled to Redridge County on assignment for a magazine article about rural Americana. Ellen was documenting abandoned homesteads when she discovered the ruins of the old Jones property. The house had burned down in 1923 under mysterious circumstances, but the foundation remained, as did the family burial plot. Ellen photographed the marked graves, and then, exploring further, discovered the unmarked section where the 6 bodies had been found in 1887. In one of her photographs, developed a week later in her St. Louis darkroom, something impossible appeared. In the background, barely visible among the trees at the edge of the cemetery, was a female figure, pale, dressed in what appeared to be a white nightgown, staring directly at the camera. Ellen had been alone when she took the photograph. She had seen nothing unusual at the time. The photograph was published in the magazine article, but was generally dismissed as a trick of light or a double exposure. Ellen herself never returned to Redridge County. In a letter to her sister, dated November 1964, she wrote, "I have photographed war zones and disaster scenes. I have seen death up close, but nothing has disturbed me like that photograph. The figure in the trees, I can't explain it, but when I look at her eyes, I feel cold, as if she's still there, waiting, watching. I've developed nightmares since returning home, always the same dream, a woman in white, calling my name, asking me to come closer." Ellen Graves died in 1967 of acute anemia. Doctors were unable to determine the cause of her sudden decline. In March 1978, a local construction company was hired to survey land north of the old Jones property for a proposed housing development. The survey team included a young geologist named Marcus Webb, who discovered that the cave system sealed in 1887 had partially reopened due to natural erosion and groundwater shifts. Against explicit warnings from older residents, Webb and 2 colleagues entered the cave system to document its structure. They brought cameras, climbing equipment, and several hours of battery-powered lighting. They found the bridal chamber. The altar was still there, the skeleton of the first bride still lying upon it, now partially covered by limestone deposits. The symbols carved into the walls remained visible, and scattered around the chamber were bones, more bones than could be accounted for by the 7 bodies documented in 1887. But what truly terrified the surveyors was what they found in a side passage leading deeper into the cave system. Makeshift bed, constructed from animal pelts and cloth. Recent cloth, not a century old. Empty tin cans, rust spotted but recognizable as modern products. and scratched into the cave wall in handwriting that matched samples preserved from Alice Jones's school papers, a single message: "I remember, I wait, I hunger, 1978. Marcus Webb photographed everything. The Redridge County Sheriff's Department investigated and officially concluded that transients had been using the cave system. The modern artifacts were dismissed as unrelated to the historical case. The writing on the wall was attributed to a hoaxer familiar with local legends, but Marcus Webb knew better. In an interview given shortly before his death in 2003, he stated, "We found strands of hair near that makeshift bed, long dark hair. We sent samples to a lab for analysis. They came back with impossible results. The hair was human, but the cellular structure was wrong, degraded in a way that suggested extreme age, yet the hair itself was not decomposed. The lab couldn't explain it. I can't explain it, but I know what I felt in that cave. I felt watched. I felt that something ancient and angry was in there with us, just beyond the reach of our lights." The cave was sealed again, this time with concrete and steel barriers. A county ordinance was passed, making it illegal to enter. The housing development was built 3 miles south of the original site. In the decades since, the legend of the Vampire Bride has become part of Redridge County's identity. The town now has a small historical museum that includes a section on local folklore, presenting the Alice Jones case alongside other regional ghost stories. But residents who have lived in the area for generations know it's more than folklore. Sightings continue to be reported, always in October, always near the old Jones property or the sealed cave. A pale woman in white, dark eyes, a smile that chills the blood. In October 2019, a teenage girl named Jessica Thornton disappeared for 3 days while hiking near the cave system. She was found wandering along Highway 7, disoriented and unable to explain where she had been. Her feet were cut and bleeding. She was severely anemic and had to be hospitalized for a week. When questioned by police, Jessica described a dream she'd had during her missing time. A woman with dark hair and impossibly black eyes who told her stories about weddings and blood and eternal hunger. The woman's name, she said, was Alice. The case remains unsolved. So what are we to make of the Vampire Bride of Redridge County? What truly happened to Alice Jones in those 7 days she spent missing in October 1887? And more disturbingly, what happened in the century and more that followed? The rational mind searches for logical explanations. Perhaps Alice suffered from a rare medical condition, porphyria, a blood disorder that causes extreme sensitivity to sunlight, anemia, and in severe cases can lead to changes in dental structure. The receding gums associated with advanced porphyria could make teeth appear elongated, fang-like. This would explain her physical symptoms, though it would not explain the deaths, the cave chamber, or the sightings that have persisted for over a century. Another theory suggests psychological trauma. Alice may have been abducted during her initial disappearance, subjected to horrific abuse that fractured her mind. The story of the Covenant, the vampire, transformation could have been a collective delusion born from community guilt and the superstitious nature of 1880s rural America. The deaths of Samuel Tucker and Sarah Brennan might have been coincidental, their cause attributed to Alice only because fear needed a target. This theory is popular among modern skeptics, but it struggles to account for the physical evidence. The unmarked graves, the bridal chamber, Margaret Jones's detailed journal. A third possibility is more sinister. Perhaps there was indeed a cult in Redridge County, a secret society that practiced ritual murder and used the legend of vampirism as cover. The Jones women may have been victims, not perpetrators. The Covenant could have been real, but not supernatural. Simply a multi-generational criminal conspiracy that sacrificed young women for reasons we can only guess at. Power, control, insanity masked as tradition. This theory has merit, but it too fails to explain the modern sightings, the impossible evidence found in 1978, or Jessica Thornton's disappearance in 2019. And then there is the theory that requires us to abandon our comfortable rationalism entirely. The theory that what happened in Redridge County was exactly what it appeared to be, a supernatural curse, a genuine transformation, a covenant with something ancient and evil that existed long before America was settled and will exist long after our cities crumble to dust. Perhaps Alice Jones did become a vampire, trapped in the caves beneath. Redridge County, sustained by whatever dark power turned her, waiting through the decades for an opportunity to feed, to escape, to reclaim the life that was stolen from her. Sheriff James Cordell died in 1923, taking most of his secrets to the grave. His last journal entry, written just days before his death, reads simply, "I have lived with what I saw in that cave for 36 years. I have told myself it was madness, hallucination, a trick of shadows and fear. But I know the truth. Some things cannot be explained. Some horrors cannot be rationalized away. Alice Jones was not human when I last saw her, and I do not believe she is dead." Eliott Bailey never married. He lived alone on his family farm until his death in 1941, reportedly tormented by nightmares of Alice calling to him from beneath the earth. His final words, according to the nurse who attended him, were, "She's still there, still waiting, still hungry." Dr. Benjamin Thorne left Redridge County in 1892 and never spoke publicly about the case again. To this day, no one knows the truth. The cave remains sealed. The Jones property lies abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. And on October nights, when the moon is dark and the wind carries the scent of decay, some residents of Redridge County still report seeing a figure in white moving through the trees searching. Perhaps she searches for Eliott, the man who loved her enough to try to set her free. Perhaps she searches for her next victim. Or perhaps she simply searches for a way to end the curse that has bound her for over a century, trapped between life and death, human and monster, bride and predator. The vampire bride of Redridge County is more than a legend. She is a warning. A reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed, some covenants once made cannot be broken, and some hungers can never be satisfied. What do you believe happened to Alice Jones? Was she victim or monster? Was the curse real, or was this a tragedy of mental illness and mass hysteria? Share your theories in the comments below. This is our haunted community, and your voice matters. Your perspective adds to the collective investigation of these dark mysteries. If you want to journey deeper into America's forgotten horrors, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. There are more stories waiting in the shadows. Stories of curses and creatures, of disappeared towns and unsolved murders, of the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface of our nation's history. Thank you for joining me on this descent into the past. Until we meet again in the darkness, remember, the past is never truly dead. It's not even past. It waits, just below the surface, ready to reach up and pull us down into its cold embrace. Stay curious, stay skeptical, but most of all, stay safe. This has been the story of the vampire bride of Redridge County, and like Alice Jones herself, it will haunt you long after the telling is done.